Hello, I'm Felicia Jackson.
And I am Giulia Bottaro.
Welcome to Shake and Not Burn. Every day we're bombarded with headlines of crisis and disruption, from climate shocks to inequality to AI upheaval.
But behind the noise are choices, patterns, and opportunities. What we need is sustainability literacy, the clarity and confidence to interpret complexity, see trade-offs, and make decisions.
Our podcast goes beyond the headlines to uncover how real people are tackling change and what we can learn from them.
You can use these ideas to stay steady, even unshakable, in a world that feels uncertain.
This is Shaken Not Burned. Welcome back to Shaken Not Burned. The ocean floor may not look like much from the surface, but it's one of the world's largest carbon stores. And when industrial trawls churn it up, carbon that should stay locked away gets released, adding to climate pressures. Yet despite bold promises like Europe's pledge to protect 30% of its seas by 2030, the reality is the tools that we have, marine protected areas, they're often paper parks. They're not actually really protected. My guest today is Professor Callum Roberts. He's a leading marine biologist and contributor to the Charlemagne Prize Academy report on Europe's ocean targets. He also leads the Convex Seascape Survey, a 5-year initiative to understand how human activity affects ocean carbon. Affects seabed carbon. Today we're going to explore what the science tells us, why it matters for climate and for economies, and how better protection could shift risk for industries and supply chains far beyond any individual coast. So, Callum, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Now, the seabed isn't often part of the wider climate conversation. Why does it matter what happens to carbon stores at the ocean floor?
Carbon stores in the sea are really, that's the ultimate repository of carbon, other than the geological carbon that is stored within the rocks. So in terms of the biological part of the carbon cycle, the active part of the carbon cycle on the planet, the sea is a recipient of carbon, and it has been building up stores of carbon over time. For example, river runoff going into the sea, that carries organic material that is plant-derived or animal-derived, and then it's deposited into the ocean. Some of it gets into the sediment at the bottom of the sea and is stored for the long term. If you look at the sediment layers in the seabed, it's only the top layer of sediment which is oxygenated, and below that there is no oxygen, and so it means that carbon, organic material from animal and plant life in those anoxic layers is basically held intact and gradually over time gets buried deeper and deeper as sediments accumulate. So these are very important stores of carbon, just like peat bogs are on land, for example, or permafrost in the Arctic. They're places where carbon is stored for the periods of hundreds or thousands of years.
And this is an absolutely fascinating mental model for those of us who are not experts in seabeds, because it is exactly like the formation of rocks and mountains. It's just underneath the water, underneath an enormous amount of pressure. I mean, can I ask you what first drew you towards marine ecosystems, and why has seabed carbon become such a focus for you?
Well, I started out as a marine biologist studying coral reefs in the Red Sea, and I think anybody who has ever seen a coral reef will know just immediately how appealing they are, and they're just thronging with life, and the incredible variety of life, very colorful, hugely different. It's an energetic place to be. The corals make these extraordinary gardens underwater, and I was smitten by them, frankly, as a student, and I decided then that I would study marine science for the rest of my life. This was there's nothing else that I wanted to do more. Latterly, I've come upon this project, the Convex Seascape Survey, which I'm running at the moment, to study seabed carbon. And, my career has moved over time more and more towards trying to understand how people have an impact upon ocean life, and what we can do about that impact. And a problem that obviously is really critically important is what is the role of the ocean in mitigating climate change, and that sort of bubbled up to the surface as one of the most important questions of our time. And I got introduced to Stephen Catlin, who is the chairman of Convex Insurance Group, and Stephen is a long-time philanthropist towards ocean science. He supported the Catlin Arctic Survey in about 2008 to 10. He then supported a survey of the world's coral reefs, and now he's supporting this big exercise to understand ocean carbon stores. And I'm very fortunate to be the chief scientist on that.
It sounds like an amazing thing to be able to experience, even aside from the value that comes from the work. And I will say you paint an incredible picture of life in the sea with coral reefs, because it literally drew pictures from David Attenborough programs just to my head. I could see them playing in my head. One of the things that's really interesting for me is understanding the interaction between human economic processes and the way in which the carbon stores work. And I think that's why marine protected areas, the concept of them is so important, because the idea, as I understand it, is that MPAs are areas where you're not supposed to do things like bottom trawling, and fishing is supposed to be managed. But I think for listeners who are new to this, why do MPAs matter? How does bottom trawling disturb carbon? And what's the scale of the impact we think it has?
Well, just to roll back a little bit, bottom trawling is the use of mobile fishing gears that are dragged along the seabed behind boats. And those gears have been in use for centuries. The first record we have of a bottom trawl is from 1376 in the Parliament Roll of Edward III. And fascinatingly and very tellingly, it is a complaint. And it says something like, the commoners petition the king that wherein creeks and havens of the sea there used to be plenteous fishing for the benefit of all, certain fishers have subtly contrived an instrument that is made in the manner of an oyster dredge, but is much longer and heavier, and the great and long iron of this trawl runs so heavily and hardly across the seabed that it destroys the flowers of the land below water there, and the spat of oysters upon which the great fish are accustomed to be fed. And so this incredibly eloquent description of bottom trawling is as apt today as ever. It tells you that it's very destructive in its being dragged across the seabed. Basically, it takes away all the marine life that lives on the seabed. And in the process, it also catches huge quantities of life, or at least it did in the 1300s. And that was wasted largely. The commoners also expressed their disgust at how much fish was being wasted, because it couldn't be used, it couldn't be sold, it was spoiling.
But isn't that the case again today? Isn't that what happens?
It is exactly the case today. All of the elements of that complaint remain current today. And I think one of the things that we see is, for example, in David Attenborough's Ocean film, he lifted the lid on what is really going on underwater as a bottom trawl is dragged across the seabed. And those who have seen the movie will have been horrified to see those huge nets towed across the seabed, and the fish trying desperately to escape, and marine life being flattened as the net was dragged along. In fact, though, if that film had been made in the 1300s, it would have been far worse. We would have been horrified at the damage that was being done, because the seabed then was very different from the way it is now. And the reason is that it was intact and undisturbed, and nobody had actually destroyed anything there yet. And so when those first trawls came in, they encountered very dense, let's call them marine animal forests. These are seabed covered in animals. So, all the brittle stars, sea nettles, sea fans, corals, sponges, all of these things form this incredible seascape, this habitat underwater. What we know now, though, is that was literally trawled away over the course of centuries. A recent study, which was part of the Convex Seascape Survey, looked back at records of oysters from hundreds of years ago. And what the lead author, Ruth Thurston, and her colleagues discovered is that the the oyster reefs that used to cover the seabed in Europe were all towed away by oyster dredges and trawls more than 100 years ago, so that today, instead of 17,000 square kilometers of seabed covered in oyster reefs, we have literally none. This is a
It's
habitat
insane.
that is essentially extinct, and people are trying to restore these oysters now in a few patches. But this is a symptom of the transformation of the seabed by trawling. One of the problems is that until recently, science hasn't recognized that the seabed has been transformed. You know, when I was a student, and I grew up in the northeast of Scotland in the 1970s, and when I learned to scuba dive there, I found
That
the
sounds cold.
seabed. It was very cold, yes. You can see why I like coral reefs when I first encountered them. But the seabed was fairly naked. It was barren. It was made up of shifting sands and gravels and muds, and bits of trash were lying on the bottom here and there. But the reason that it was like that is it was entirely unnatural. It's because of the way that we have trawled and dredged it over the course of centuries. And so if I was to instead have dived in the seas of the 1300s, I would have found much more marine life on the bottom, and a very different kind of ecosystem. The problem is that we didn't recognize this transformation, as I said, until recently. And so people think that this is the normal state of the sea, that it's always been this way. And the natural conclusion from that is, well, there's nothing really worth protecting there. And so a lot of these marine sandy sediments that stretch out across the seabed around Europe have been unprotected for a long while. And where they are protected, they're not protected from the things they need to be protected from. So scientists looked at them as these protected areas were being created, and they said, you know what, these worms and crabs and so on, they can cope with being hit by trawls, and therefore they don't need protection from trawls. And of course, this was misconstruing the fact that they're only there because of this continuous disturbance of the seabed by these human activities. And so the animals that are there now are the ones that can cope with being trawled, but they're not the ones that would be there if we stopped trawling. And so
it's the ocean equivalent of the Sahara Desert, whatever can survive with the least support.
I'd say that, the seabed is dominated by the rats and cockroaches of the sea. These are the things that are left behind after everything else is gone. It's a really degraded and depleted environment. 200 years ago, what we were catching by way of fish was dramatically different from what we catch now. And so the sea was far fuller of wildlife than it is today. Again, Ruth Thurston has done this amazing study in which she used the records of catches from 1889, which was the first year that fish statistics were gathered, all the way through to 2010. And what she found was that for the fisheries of England and Wales using bottom trawls, that landings had declined by 5 times between 1889 and 2010. Now you think, well,
I assume that's continuing to happen.
Well, it's even worse than that, because, the fleet in 1889 was made up of sailing vessels largely. Today, it's a very sophisticated, very powerful fleet. And when you account for that difference in fishing power, the change is that there's 17 times less fish being caught in 2010 per unit of fishing power expended than there were in the 1890s. We've lost so much from the sea, and what we have now, we can see needs protecting, and we can see it needs recovering. And that was the motivation to create marine protected area networks in the UK and in Europe, and more generally across the world.
There's so many fascinating areas of discussion that come out of this. But I think the two key ones for me are the importance the importance of life within the ocean and the role of the ocean in carbon storage, but also actually helping people understand what it means to them and the implications if we don't protect these things. Because when you talk about the fall in fishing input, or what do I call it, fishing input, the fall in the number of fish caught over that period of time, that makes sense. But maybe to some people, well, aren't you going to get fish somewhere else? I remember a discussion about how the economics change and how it changes what we do culturally and socially. And I think that's something that people really need to understand, because there was research that showed that oysters that are seen as delicious, 5-star delicacies used to be the food of the poor because there were so many of them, and that servants would have written into their contracts in the 19th century that they couldn't be fed oysters more than twice a week. So what happens in the ocean fundamentally changes not just global supply chains, but the individual way in which we experience the world around us. So that, and then the importance of the complexity of life within the ocean, because what you're talking about is really an incredibly sad mental picture. The idea that of this rich forest under the sea that's turned into a sort of sandy wasteland is depressing in and of itself. It feels a very negative thing. And so weirdly, it almost combines the two things that matter for sustainability, one of which is understanding the economic and social impacts and quantifying the risk so that countries and investors care, while at the same time recognizing that ethical imperative to protect what should be protected. It's that public good. So I suppose where that takes me to is actually the Convex Seascape Survey, because isn't that what you're trying to understand? What is happening on the ocean floor?
That's exactly what we're trying to do. And, for years, we've been building up this picture of how animal communities, plant communities on the seabed have been changing as a result of human activities and how they need protection. But we've ignored the fact that the marine environment plays a very important role in the Earth's carbon cycle, and because of that, in terms of climate regulation. On land, we've also become aware of the importance of protecting natural carbon stores. So forests, for example, and peat bogs and permafrost, these are areas that store very large amounts of carbon, and their protection is enshrined in nature conservation policy, in government targets to reduce carbon emissions and achieve net zero. But the ocean has been omitted from this picture. And so one of the things that we are gradually coming around to understanding is that disturbance of carbon stores under the sea is also something we need to get to grips with and understand and protect those carbon stores so that we don't accelerate climate change.
Just interrupt and ask a question, because I was reading about how the ability of the ocean to store carbon seems to have fallen in the last few years, far more than was estimated. Do you think that's because there's just too many emissions around? Or do you think it's part and parcel of the aridity? It sounds weird to describe the ocean as arid, but the sort of lack of complex life within the ocean.
One of the things that causes the ocean to take up carbon is phytoplankton, and these are the little plant plankton that live in the water column. And those plant plankton depend on nutrients and light that are in those surface layers. And what we found is that as a result of global warming, the surface layer is becoming more stable and less mixed, and the nutrients are deep down, and they need to get up to where the light is to fuel that plankton growth. So they take up carbon dioxide and turn it into plant material.
And feed whales, I remember that.
And also feed all sorts of things. They're right at the bottom of the ocean food web. So falling ocean productivity is going to slow the rate of carbon dioxide absorption by the sea. But the carbon dioxide sink in the ocean has actually grown over time as a result of some fairly complex changes over the course of the last couple of centuries. But as more and more carbon dioxide dissolves in the water, so less can dissolve from the atmosphere into the sea. So we're seeing that sort of saturation gradually slowing the rate of uptake. But that said, the important thing is to make sure that the sediments stay intact and they protect their stored carbon, because if you disturb them, that organic carbon, that dead plant material and animal material, gets resuspended, and then microbes attack it and digest it, and they release carbon dioxide. So that
So if you
disturbs.
don't keep it fixed down on the ocean floor, you're basically re-releasing what has been stored, and that's the problem with bottom trawling.
Exactly, yes.
Okay.
And so it's like burning forests. It's like, peat bogs that are being turned into garden compost. These are bad things to do with carbon stores. And particularly what we're understanding from the Convex Seascape Survey is that those carbon stores in some places are really rich, really deep, really important. They hold enormous quantities of organic carbon. What we're also discovering, however, is that those areas have become among the most heavily targeted by the bottom trawl fleets across Europe and the world, in fact, because they host these prawns.
Because they're rich with life. So fish.
They in particular, nephrops prawns, and those are more familiar to British listeners as scampi. And so people are going after them. They're a valuable catch, and having depleted so many other species of fish, they're still there and they're still producing valuable catches over time. But those animals are being targeted in the areas of richest carbon deposits, and that is leading to the loss of carbon from those great mud banks, and that is a problem for us.
So are these incredibly rich areas of ocean under marine protected areas, or is one of the questions whether we should specifically be putting marine protection area protection in these densely complex areas? Because one thing that I'm interested in, once you've answered that question, is just how effective they are, because we've seen in the water industry in the UK, for example, that while there is a framework in place that says pollution shouldn't be released into the rivers, sometimes it's cheaper to release into the rivers than it is to pay a fine. So perhaps we could go back to that question of, are these particularly complex and rich areas of marine life under protection at all?
Well, the interesting thing here is that there's two things wrapped up in this, is that we have been creating marine protected areas in Britain and across Europe. And in the UK, we have nominally protected 38% of our seas. So we've surpassed the international target to protect 30% of our seas by 2030, which seems good at face value. But as you said in the introduction to this interview, it's actually, a lot of it is paper parks. We still continue to impact upon those areas using industrial fishing. Of course, there's also oil and gas and wind farms and all sorts of other activities that go on offshore that impact upon the marine environment too. And so these protected areas are not really protected. Most of them, the great majority, more than 90%, are not even protected from bottom trawling and dredging. And that is a real problem, because we're carrying on with business as usual. We're calling it protected, job done, but nature is not being protected and recovery is not happening.
Don't quite understand how it can be called a marine protected area if it's not protected.
Neither do I.
Oh, okay.
And I think this is the conundrum here, because if you look at the processes by which these protected areas were created, what happened was that people came together to identify the areas that were rich in wildlife, that were representative of marine biodiversity as a whole and the different kinds of habitats that were there. And then those places were recommended for protection to the minister, and then it all started to unravel as scientists said, well, there's only worms in this one, so we don't really need to protect them. So rather than saying, what would this be like if we offered it protection from these impacts that people are having, and we gave those sites protection, what would the wildlife recover to? How would the habitat look after 10 or 15 or 20 years? No, instead, we've just accepted the status quo, and we've instead of having degraded seas that are there by default, we've mandated that our protected areas remain degraded by setting conservation objectives that say we want to maintain it in the
rather
state
than
that it's in,
regenerating it.
rather than regenerating it. And so at the time that these protected areas were created, the marine conservation zones in England and Wales, paradoxically, 90% of them had conservation objectives of maintain as they are rather than recover. We've got a wildly flawed system of marine protection in this country, one that is based on wishful thinking rather than any scientific basis of evidence that what you get out of a protected area depends on the protection that you put in. I took part in a global study of marine protected areas a couple of years ago, in which we looked at the recovery of marine life and the levels of protection that had been given to the protected areas that they were in. And we assessed all of these various protected areas, and we assigned them to different levels of protection, from minimal to lightly protected to highly protected to fully protected. And what was clear is that the heavy lifting in terms of nature conservation and recovery was all done by the highly and fully protected sites. And that means
Which does make
absolutely no
sense.
industrial fishing. It does make sense, yes. It's not a surprise.
The thing that fascinates me here is this question of how we change that perception, because you mentioned regeneration, and this has become more and more of an issue when looking at all sorts of different elements of nature. And it does seem to make no sense that a protected area would have a focus of maintaining it in that arid state. So I think, but there's a bigger issue here about what we actually understand about the ocean and how it could be regenerated. There's a perception that the ocean is too vast, either to be harmed or to be changed. What do you think the biggest myth is about ocean resilience? What do you think could change the way in which we look at it?
Well, you've put your finger on it there. We did think that the ocean was vast, and the ocean is vast. And if you look at the volume of the sea, it occupies about 97% of the living space on planet Earth. So it's an
fairly
absolutely
big.
enormous space. And so people thought that there was no way that anything we do could have more than localized impacts. There was no way we could change the ocean on a global scale. And we were wrong in that. And the other thing that vast size suggested to us is that we could get rid of anything that we didn't want into the sea with no comeback. And that too is not true. And we see that in the buildup of plastics and chemical pollution and nutrient pollution all over the world. So we are having impacts at global scales now. And that's one of the reasons why the world community has said, you know what, we need to protect 30% of land and sea. And 30% is a minimum, by the way. We did the science on that that underpins that target. And that science said that if you were to fully protect that 30%, then you would be able to just achieve the sort of basic conservation objectives of things like representing all of the different variety of species and habitats in marine protected areas, and contributing to fisheries as well by the rebuilding of fish populations.
I think there's always been a challenge in policy circles because the science can provide an evidence base, provide a direction of travel. But in the end, if you're going to get the global community of countries to agree to a policy framework, they're probably going to agree to the most basic thing that they can, because you've got companies with wildly different agendas and interests who are trying to coalesce around some kind of necessary intervention. When the Global Biodiversity Framework was signed, and I was incredibly excited about the potential for this being a starting point for how we actively change the way in which we address the loss of nature and biodiversity. But very little has happened, and that's a 30% target as well, and I'm not seeing any moves towards that. The question of countries coalescing around the lowest agreeable level is actually fairly important. You talked a little bit by mentioning nutrient pollution and chemical pollution and plastic pollution, but I think we need to understand how seabed protection actually connects to those bigger goals, whether that's net zero or biodiversity, or as is increasingly coming up, questions about food security and the food web.
That's right. There's this false perception that restricting fishing is going to not only damage jobs, but also impact upon our food security. Actually, not restricting fishing is what's impacting on our food security. If you look at the long history of fisheries in Europe, we've seen them decline because they have not been sufficiently regulated over time. You know, we need to fish less using less destructive methods, and we need to protect more. Those are fundamentals to a sustainable use of the ocean environment. And we're not there yet. You know, nominally, this level of protection that looks good in countries like the UK, but we need to ramp up the actual protection that those areas are receiving to get the benefits to fish and habitats that will help underpin productive and sustainable fishing industries.
Those elements you've just mentioned, those are the things that meaningful protection would look like. So beyond the headlines, that's what we need to see in any process that's about protecting 30% of land and ocean by 2030.
Yes, we need to be creating genuinely protected areas that restrict the things that destroy the animal life and the plant life in those places. Otherwise, there's no point in having a protected area. There's no point in calling it protected. Nobody benefits from fake protection. So what we need to do is we need to expand the level of protection within those protected areas. We need to do it across the whole of the area, because all of that space will recover as time goes on, given the right level of protection. You mentioned earlier about these mud deposits and how are they in protected areas. Well, we've done an analysis, and it says that a lot of that mud is not inside the protected area network. And the reason for that is a sort of mud bigotry, if you like. We don't think that there's very much about mud which is attractive or worth protecting. And we also have the mistaken belief that that mud will not benefit from protection and doesn't need it anyway.
To me, mud is, and regular listeners will know I'm obsessed about soil, but mud is basically wet soil, and it must be full of nutrients and life forms and the basis for everything that grows out of it.
It is indeed, and it is impacted by human activities, and we don't want to release that carbon, and we do need to safeguard it in properly protected areas of the sea.
So what do you think are the barriers holding us back from these stronger protections? I realise there's many, many complicated issues around the world, but are there sort of particular political or economic barriers that we have to deal with? Or, as you say, is it more a question of people not really understanding what it is that needs protecting and why?
I think a lot of people don't understand what needs protecting and why, and there's a great deal of misunderstanding regarding the seabed and sediments on the seabed. People don't realize how much richer it would be if we protected it. They don't realize how vulnerable it is, and those two things are why it's so underprotected. So we need to change that. We need to change attitudes. But we also need to change a political system in which the fishing industry has disproportionate clout in terms of vetoing decisions about nature protection. And in fact, that industry is shooting itself in the foot continuously by vetoing the protection that would rebuild the fish stocks and the habitats they depend on so their fisheries would be more productive. The greatest cheerleaders for the end of the fishing industry are people within the industry itself. They have been begging ministers not to protect fish stocks for so long. It's become embedded in the psyche. And so in terms of avoiding pain in the short term to rebuild and recover, they're simply condemning themselves to irrelevance in the future. You see all around the country, coastal fishing communities are saying, well, we're all going out of business. There's no fish here. They're blaming it on all sorts of things like people coming in from Europe or whatever. The real reason is there's not enough protection for those fish stocks and they can't recover. And so we've taken too many fish. We've eaten too many fish, and we're not letting the fish stocks have the breathing space that they need to be productive.
I'm fascinated by this idea of the industry itself being one of the biggest barriers, because you see that in a number of different areas where certain companies, certain processes, they are considered best practice. They are the status quo. And people within those industries are almost incapable of imagining a different future. And then you also have the obvious problem that in our political and economic system, we're not exactly good at having conversations about trade-offs, having conversations about short-term costs, which scare politicians to long-term benefits. To a certain extent, what you're talking about simply supports the fact that if we are going to protect what we need to protect, we do need to have very different conversations, and we need to start engaging in different ways. One of the areas I'm really interested in getting your perspective on is how this is going to play out in global negotiations, because obviously we're coming up to COP30 for climate in Belém in November, but the High Seas Treaty, how can that make a difference? How do you see it playing out?
So the ocean has begun to feature a little bit more in these climate conferences, but it's not been meaningfully incorporated in the way that forests have, for example. We've got targets for forest reforestation and so on, which are embedded in this process, but the ocean has been neglected, and that's partly a reason of lack of science, and that's what we're trying to fill with the Convex Seascape Survey. The High Seas Treaty is a different part of this, and it's a United Nations treaty. It's just been ratified and it'll come into force in January next year, and it provides for the first time a globally agreed process for establishing marine protected areas in international waters. And that is really important because international waters cover 61% of the ocean and a staggering 43% of the surface of the Earth. In terms of the volume of living space that they occupy, that's 3/4 of the living space on Earth is in these international waters. So protecting them now is really, really important. We will never achieve the global biodiversity framework target of 30% ocean protection without establishing protected areas in the high seas.
And it just to interrupt, was the problem before the High Seas Treaty was signed was that nothing applied to international waters?
Well, the Convention on Biological Diversity, which is the global framework agreement on protecting nature, it states that countries must apply the terms, the provisions of the convention within their sovereign land and sea. It doesn't
So it
say
did leave it
anything
out.
about international waters. So there's this kind of half planet-sized hole in nature protection, and that is really, really
Amazing.
bad. So the net result is that at the moment, about 22% of the area of countries' sovereign waters are nominally protected in marine protected areas. Progress towards 30% is rapid and advancing. We've already talked about how those protected areas need much more protection, though. But in the high seas, the figure is only 1.45% of the high seas is currently protected. So almost none of it is protected. And most of that is in Antarctic waters because there is a convention in Antarctica which allows us to protect international waters there. It's not working as well as it should because Russia and China have been vetoing proposals for protected areas for a long time now. And so the high seas, international waters are woefully underprotected. Hopefully the High Seas Treaty will change that.
I remember once walking past the office for Antarctic Affairs and getting very excited about the potential for what that meant. But as you say, kind of terrifying that it's only this year that the high seas have even come into the conversation. I'm going to ask you something which may help those who are not experts get a feel for what we're really talking about. If you had to choose a metaphor for the role that oceans play, not just in terms of climate and pollution management and all of these different things, but actually in resilience. And when I say resilience, I mean our long-term ability to survive and to thrive. What would it be?
A very familiar one is that the ocean is the heart and lungs of the planet. Without it, the planet would not be alive. And a good expression from Sylvia Earle, who's a famous oceanographer, who says, no blue, no green. Basically, without that ocean, the life support system on this planet would not function. Just take, for example, what we've been doing to the planet recently, which is all of these greenhouse gas emissions. You know, those 93% of the extra heat that has been added to the planet since the onset of the Industrial Revolution has been buried in the ocean. If the ocean had not taken up that heat, the temperature above water would be 36 degrees centigrade higher than it is now.
36?
36, not one and
That's
a half degrees as
getting
we're
close to
sweating about.
kind of boiling point.
Well, it's Death Valley temperatures everywhere. You know, the world would be uninhabitable, essentially. The ocean is our planetary air conditioner. That's another metaphor which we should pay close attention to, because, you know, without it, we'd be in far worse trouble than we are now.
That really shows us the real systemic changes that we need to start addressing, both in terms of what we safeguard, but also how we address the challenges of the way in which we operate.
Exactly. We've got to give nature space on this planet for us to survive the future.
That's a wonderful, wonderful point to end our conversation on. But before we do, I'm going to ask, is there a story or a signal from your research that actually gives you hope that better ocean protection is something we can achieve?
There are marine protected areas around the world that work, and I've been lucky enough over my career to study many of them and to look at marine life literally recolonizing in front of your eyes as you go back year after year to the same places.
That's
To
amazing.
count the fish, to look at their sizes. And, you know, nature is very resilient. The naked seabed that I talked about, you know, the sand and gravels that are shifting with currents, those recolonize very quickly when you give them proper protection from industrial fishing. And
So we just have to get out of the way.
We just have to get out of the way. We need to do it in a decisive way. We need to do it across extensive areas, and we need to make sure those areas are properly protected for the long term.
And is there anything that we can do? So if there was one action you would like listeners to take, whether as voters or consumers or business leaders, is there anything we can do?
The fundamental thing now is to make it known to your local representatives, your politicians, that you want greater ocean protection, that it's not good enough to create this fake protected area network that is misleading to everybody. And it's very important that we genuinely commit to providing protection to the sea. Without doing that, nothing will change. In fact, the fishing industry is complaining right now that it's going to hell. Ministers keep giving them more fish than scientists recommend as sustainable. The only end point of that is no more fish in the sea, no fishing industry. We could all be better off if better decisions were made by politicians. And so it's really important to make your voice heard.
That's wonderful. Thank you. A lesson for life that politicians could do with a bit more, shall we say, better decision making.
Better
Definitely.
decision making.
Callum, thank you so much for your time. I found this conversation utterly fascinating. To our listeners, thank you for joining us. Just remember, the ocean is the planet's first climate regulator. And it's also, as Professor Roberts reminds us, one of our greatest blind spots. Protecting the seabed isn't just about saving biodiversity. It's actually about safeguarding the carbon and resilient systems that keep us thriving. So if we're serious about climate action, that means bringing ocean health into every conversation, from policy to finance to the way that we value natural capital itself. So thank you, Callum, for helping us see that connection more clearly. And thank you for listening to Shaken Not Burned, where we explore how sustainability and resilience are reshaping the world we share. Don't forget to subscribe and follow, and we'll be back soon.